Black elderly fed a stranger in rags. The next morning, 500 bikers surrounded her house. A quiet older woman thinks she's just helping a starving man on her porch. But by sunrise, her home shakes with the roar of hundreds of motorcycles. 500 bikers circle her yard like an army, watching her, guarding her, refusing to leave. She learns the stranger she fed isn't just some lost drifter. He's the missing son of a violent biker world, and saving him has triggered a dangerous oath. Now she's caught between two biker clans, one ready to protect her with their lives, and one ready to burn everything down to reach the man she saved. What secret did this stranger bring to her doorstep? And how far will these bikers go when kindness sparks a war? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The first rays of dawn hadn't yet touched the Alabama sky when Miss Loretta Johnson stirred from her sleep. At 82 years old, her body kept its own schedule, rousing her well before sunrise each morning without fail. She moved carefully through her farmhouse, her slippered feet shuffling across worn wooden floors that had known her steps for over 5 decades. The familiar scent of chicory coffee soon filled her small kitchen as she went about her morning routine. The old percolator sputtered and steamed, a faithful companion that had seen countless dawns by her side. Loretta pulled her faded blue robe tighter around her shoulders, warding off the pre-dawn chill that seeped through the single-pane windows of her farmhouse. "Now then," she murmured to herself, pouring the steaming coffee into her favorite china cup, the one with tiny pink roses around the rim. "Let's see who's visiting this morning." Every day, without fail, Loretta checked her porch for the neighborhood strays. Over the years, she'd become known as something of a cat whisperer among the local ferals. She kept a small bowl of dry food just inside her screen door, though lately, it seemed to attract more than just cats. As she approached the door, the beam of her flashlight caught a pair of glowing eyes near her flower pots. "Oh, you again?" She clucked her tongue at the portly raccoon that had become a regular visitor. "Shoo now, that food's not for you." The raccoon waddled away, but as Loretta opened her door to step onto the porch, her foot caught on something solid. She stumbled, catching herself on the doorframe just in time. Her heart hammered in her chest as she steadied herself and pointed her flashlight downward. "Lord have mercy," she breathed. A young man lay sprawled across her porch steps, one arm dangling over the edge. His clothes were little more than rags, torn and dirty. In the beam of her flashlight, she could see angry purple bruises marking his exposed skin. He was painfully thin, his cheekbones sharp beneath the dirt and blood on his face. 40 years of nursing experience kicked in immediately. Loretta set her coffee down and knelt beside him, her old knees protesting the movement. She pressed 2 fingers against his neck, relieved to find a pulse, though it was weaker than she'd like. "Young man," she called softly, patting his cheek. "Can you hear me?" He didn't respond, but she could see the shallow rise and fall of his chest. The morning air was cool, and his skin felt clammy under her touch. She needed to get him inside, but at her age, there was no way she could lift him. "The Lord provides," she reminded herself, remembering the wheeled garden cart she kept by the porch. With careful maneuvering and more strength than she thought she still possessed, Loretta managed to roll the young man onto the cart. It wasn't dignified, but it would have to do. Inside, she transformed her living room couch into a makeshift hospital bed, covering it with old sheets before transferring him there. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency as she gathered supplies. Clean cloths, warm water, antiseptic, and her well-stocked first aid kit. "You're safe now," she murmured as she worked, cleaning dirt and blood from his face with gentle strokes. The bruises were worse than she'd first thought, and she suspected at least one broken rib from the way he winced in his unconscious state when she touched his side. Loretta covered him with her warmest quilts, the ones her grandmother had made, their familiar patterns a comfort even in times of distress. She heated chicken broth on the stove, the same recipe she'd used countless times during her nursing days when patients needed gentle nourishment. When the broth was ready, she sat beside him, slowly spooning small amounts between his cracked lips. "Easy now," she soothed when he coughed slightly. "Just a little at a time." His eyes flickered open briefly, unfocused and glazed with fever. His lips moved, forming a single word that came out as barely more than a whisper. "Read." "Read," Loretta repeated, but he had already slipped back into unconsciousness. She settled into her rocking chair beside the couch, her mother's old Afghan across her lap. The grandfather clock in the corner marked the passing hours with steady ticks as she kept her vigil. Occasionally, she dozed, her head nodding forward only to snap back up at the slightest sound from her patient. The night deepened, and Loretta found herself praying as she rocked. She prayed for the young man's healing, for guidance in helping him, and for protection if he was in some kind of trouble, which, given his condition, seemed likely. As the clock struck 4 in the morning, a new sound caught her attention. At first it was just a vibration, so low she felt it more than heard it. Then it grew stronger, making the windows tremble in their frames. A deep rumble, like distant thunder, but steady and growing closer. Loretta's hands stilled on her knitting needles as she listened. The sound was familiar, though she couldn't quite place it. Whatever it was getting nearer, and she had a feeling her quiet night was about to become considerably less peaceful. The windows continued to vibrate, the sound now unmistakably mechanical rather than natural. She glanced at the young man on her couch, still unconscious but breathing steadily under her grandmother's quilts. That single word he'd spoken, "read," suddenly seemed more significant as the rumbling grew louder, and Loretta Johnson prepared herself for whatever the approaching dawn might bring. The morning sun was just beginning to peek through Miss Loretta's kitchen curtains as she stirred a pot of steel-cut oatmeal on the stove. She had always believed that a good breakfast was essential for healing, and her unexpected guest would need proper nourishment when he woke. The warm, comforting smell of cinnamon and brown sugar filled her small kitchen as she added a pinch of salt to the bubbling pot. The rumble she'd heard in the early hours hadn't completely subsided. Instead, it had grown stronger, like rolling thunder approaching across her property. The windows rattled in their frames, and the spoons hanging on her wall began to dance against each other with a gentle tinkling sound. Loretta turned down the heat under the oatmeal and made her way to the window, her hand trembling slightly as she pulled back the gingham curtain. What she saw made her freeze in place, her other hand flying to her throat in shock. Motorcycles, hundreds of them. They filled her driveway, spilled across her carefully tended lawn, and stretched down the dirt road as far as she could see. She counted at least 500 riders, all wearing leather vests covered in patches and insignias. They sat silently on their bikes, forming a protective circle around her modest farmhouse. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, watching as the machines went quiet one by one. The riders remained still, like an army awaiting orders. Then, from the front of the group, a massive figure dismounted his bike. He stood head and shoulders above the others, his long dark hair woven into intricate braids that fell past his shoulders. Elaborate tattoos covered his muscled arms, visible beneath a leather vest that bore a prominent patch reading Reed Clan. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, walking purposefully toward her front porch. His heavy boots made the wooden steps creak as he climbed them. Loretta's heart was pounding, but years of dealing with emergencies as a nurse had taught her to keep her composure. She opened the door before he could knock. "Good morning," she said firmly, standing straight despite having to crane her neck to look up at him. "I'm Miss Loretta Johnson." The giant of a man's expression softened slightly, showing a glimpse of kindness beneath his intimidating exterior. "Ma'am," he said, his voice deep but respectful. "I'm Bear Reed. We're looking for the boy." Loretta studied, his face carefully. There was something in his eyes, worry, perhaps even fear, that told her more than his words did. "You mean the young man who collapsed on my porch last night?" Bear's shoulders tensed. "Yes, ma'am." "Is he—" He couldn't seem to finish the question. "He's alive," Loretta assured him quickly. "He's inside, unconscious but stable. Are you family?" "He's my son," Bear said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "His name is Caleb." Loretta nodded, pieces falling into place. The whispered Reed made sense now. "You'd better come in, Mr. Reed, but first, please tell your people to be careful of my flower beds. I've got prize-winning dahlias out there." A surprised laugh escaped Bear's lips, and he turned to signal to his riders. With military precision, several of them began directing others to move their bikes away from her carefully tended gardens. Inside, Bear's imposing frame seemed to fill her small living room. But when he saw Caleb lying on the couch, covered in quilts, his entire demeanor changed. He dropped to his knees beside the couch with a grace that belied his size, one large hand hovering uncertainly over his son's bruised face. "What happened to him?" Loretta asked softly, standing nearby with her hands clasped. "It's complicated," Bear replied, his eyes never leaving Caleb's face. "We've been searching for him for 3 days. When we got word he was in this area—" He trailed off, then finally looked up at Loretta. "You took him in. You helped him when he needed it." "Of course I did," Loretta said simply. "Any decent person would have." Bear shook his head. "No, ma'am. Many wouldn't, not knowing what might follow." He stood slowly, towering over her once again. "Our clan follows an ancient oath, passed down through generations. Protect the one who protects our own. You helped my son when he was at his most vulnerable. Now you're under our protection." Before Loretta could respond, Bear walked to the front door and opened it. His voice carried across the yard as he called out orders. "Secure the perimeter. I want eyes on every approach. Set up a medical station in the barn. Rodriguez, get your tech team working on surveillance, and somebody find me a contractor. Miss Johnson's porch needs reinforcing." Loretta moved to her window, watching in amazement as the scene outside transformed. Bikes were being strategically repositioned. Men and women in leather were setting up equipment, stringing cables, and establishing what looked like military-style guard posts around her property. Her quiet little farm had become a fortress in a matter of minutes. "Mr. Reed," she said, turning back to the massive man who now stood in her living room. "I appreciate the gesture, but surely all this isn't necessary." Bear's expression was grave. "Miss Johnson, you don't know what kind of trouble found my boy, but it's serious enough that he ran from his own family rather than risk bringing it to our door. The fact that he ended up here, that you helped him." He paused, looking at her intently. "That makes you family now, and we protect our family." Loretta looked around her transformed home, at the unconscious young man on her couch, the giant biker standing in her living room, and the hundreds of leather-clad figures securing her property. Her quiet life had changed dramatically in less than 24 hours, but something in her heart told her this was exactly where she needed to be. The smell of burning oatmeal suddenly reached her nose. "Oh, goodness!" she exclaimed, hurrying toward the kitchen. "Mr. Reed, would you like some breakfast? The oatmeal might be a bit scorched, but I make excellent biscuits." Behind her, she heard Bear's deep chuckle, a sound that seemed to contain equal parts amusement and respect. Outside, engines rumbled, and Boots marched across her yard as her home became the center of an operation she didn't yet understand. But Loretta Johnson had always believed that any situation could be improved with a good meal and a kind heart. So she set about making breakfast for her unexpected guests, while hundreds of bikers stood guard around her little farmhouse. The morning sun climbed higher as Loretta's quiet farmhouse buzzed with unprecedented activity. She stood in her kitchen doorway, clutching her worn apron, watching dozens of bikers move with surprising efficiency across her property. The scene before her was almost surreal. Leather-clad figures carrying lumber, checking security equipment, and patrolling the perimeter of her land. "Miss Johnson?" A deep voice called from behind her. "Where do you keep your tools?" She turned to find a tall biker with a silver beard pointing at her broken porch rails. "There's a toolbox in the barn, second shelf on the right," she replied, then added quickly, "But you don't have to—" "Ma'am, these rails are unsafe," he interrupted respectfully. "We'll have them fixed up proper before sunset." Throughout the morning, Loretta found herself constantly redirecting her attention between various activities. In the living room, Bear maintained his vigil beside Caleb, who remained unconscious but stable. Outside, the transformation of her property continued at an astounding pace. A group of bikers had taken it upon themselves to split and stack firewood behind her house, enough to last 3 winters, by her estimate. "You really don't need to do all this," she protested to a young woman who was organizing the wood pile. "Miss Johnson, you've got no idea what it means to the club that you helped Caleb," the woman replied, wiping sweat from her brow. "Besides, Bear's orders are clear. Anything you need gets done." Around 11 o'clock, Loretta realized she needed to start preparing lunch for everyone. The thought of feeding so many people seemed overwhelming, but her southern hospitality wouldn't allow her to do anything less. She began pulling out every loaf of bread she had, along with sandwich fixings from her refrigerator. As she worked, a woman in her early 30s appeared in her kitchen doorway. She had dark hair streaked with purple, intricate tattoos visible on her arms, and kind eyes that seemed at odds with her tough appearance. "Need some help?" the woman offered. "I'm Rosa, by the way. Bear sent me to check if you needed anything." Loretta smiled gratefully. "Rosa, you're a blessing. Could you help me arrange these sandwiches on trays?" As they worked together, Rosa moved with unexpected grace in the small kitchen, anticipating Loretta's needs and organizing the food efficiently. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, and Loretta found herself warming to the younger woman's presence. "Bear hasn't left Caleb's side," Rosa commented quietly as they arranged sandwiches on paper plates. "I've never seen him like this before. He's usually so controlled. But this thing with Caleb, it's got him rattled." Loretta paused in her work. "What happened to that boy? Bear mentioned something about the Iron Fangs?" Rosa's expression darkened. "They're bad news. A rival club that's been causing trouble for months. Caleb got caught up in something with them. We're not sure exactly what. But instead of coming to us for help, he just disappeared. Been running ever since." "To protect you all," Loretta murmured, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Yeah," Rosa nodded. "That's our Caleb, trying to shoulder everything alone." They distributed the sandwiches together, Rosa helping Loretta carry trays out to the bikers stationed around the property. Each recipient thanked Loretta with surprising politeness, many removing their gloves before taking their food. She noticed how they seemed to unconsciously straighten up when she approached, showing a respect that touched her deeply. In the early afternoon, while Rosa was helping her clean up from lunch, Bear finally emerged from the living room, He looked exhausted, but moved with purpose as he scanned Loretta's mantelpiece, something catching his eye. He stopped in front of an old black-and-white photograph, leaning in for a closer look. "Miss Johnson," he called out, his voice thick with emotion. "This photo—" Loretta walked over to stand beside him. The photograph showed a much younger version of herself in a nurse's uniform, kneeling beside a motorcycle on a dusty road. Next to her was a rugged-looking man with long hair and a leather vest, his arm in a makeshift sling. "That was taken in 1968, she explained softly. "I was driving home from my shift at the hospital when I found him. Bad motorcycle accident, broken collarbone and road rash everywhere. I patched him up right there on the roadside." Bear's hands trembled slightly as he touched the frame. "This is my father. The original Reed patriarch." Loretta's eyes widened. "James Reed? I had no idea who he was at the time. He tried to give me money for helping him, but I refused. Said anyone would have done the same." "He never forgot you," Bear said quietly. "Used to tell us stories about the angel nurse who helped him that day. Said it reminded him there was still good in the world." He turned to look at her, his expression soft. "Seems helping Reeds runs in your blood, Miss Johnson." As evening approached, Loretta sat in her favorite rocking chair on the newly repaired porch, wrapped in a shawl against the cooling air. She watched as the bikers set up powerful floodlights around her property, creating pools of brightness in the gathering dusk. Others were organizing themselves into night watch shifts, their movements precise and practiced. Rosa brought her a cup of tea, settling into the chair beside her. "Quite a change from yesterday, huh?" Loretta smiled, cradling the warm cup in her hands. 24 hours ago, I was shooing a raccoon off these very steps. Now look at all this." She gestured at the transformed landscape before her. The guards, the lights, the dozens of motorcycles parked in neat rows. "Amazing how life can change with just one simple act of kindness." "That's what makes it special," Rosa replied. "You didn't know who Caleb was, didn't know about the Reeds or any of this. You just helped because it was the right thing to do." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Loretta thought about the young man still unconscious in her living room, the father keeping vigil beside him, and all these people who had suddenly become part of her life. She'd always believed in the power of a shared meal to bring people together, but she never imagined it would bring her a family quite like this. The aroma of fresh coffee drifted through Loretta's farmhouse as dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and purples. Outside, bikers who had maintained their vigilant watch through the night were stretching their stiff muscles, passing thermoses of hot coffee between them. The morning dew sparkled on their motorcycles, lined up like silent sentinels along her driveway. Loretta shuffled onto her porch in her worn flannel robe, carrying her favorite ceramic mug. The morning air held a slight chill that made her pull the robe tighter around her shoulders. As she made her way down the steps to check on her flower beds, something caught her eye. Her old blue pickup truck, usually parked beside the house, had a rear tire that looked wrong, deflated and torn, with jagged cuts visible in the rubber. Her heart quickened as she moved closer to inspect the damage. That's when she noticed the piece of paper, secured to her porch railing with a wicked-looking knife. Her hands trembled slightly as she carefully removed the note. The message, written in harsh black letters, sent a chill down her spine. "Hand him over or else." "Miss Johnson?" Bear's deep voice came from behind her. She turned to find him studying her face with concern, his massive frame blocking out the early morning light. Without a word, she handed him the note. The change in his expression was immediate and frightening. His jaw clenched, and his eyes hardened as he read the message. "The Iron Fangs," he growled, crumpling the paper in his fist. "They must have tracked Caleb here somehow." "Will they really hurt people just to get to him?" Loretta asked, her voice steady despite her growing unease. Bear's expression was grim. "They're not known for making idle threats, but don't worry. We're not going anywhere." He turned to several nearby bikers. "Double the perimeter watch. I want eyes on every approach to this property." Throughout the morning, Loretta watched as her peaceful farmhouse transformed into something resembling a fortress. Bikers worked efficiently, constructing wooden barriers across vulnerable access points and reinforcing locks on doors and windows. Some climbed onto her roof to secure loose shingles and establish lookout points, while others cleared brush from around the property to eliminate potential hiding spots. As she stood at her kitchen window washing dishes, Loretta couldn't help but worry about how her neighbors and the town would react to all this activity. Pine Grove was a quiet place where everyone knew everyone else, and the sudden presence of hundreds of bikers was bound to cause concern. She could already imagine Mrs. Peterson from the grocery store spreading worried whispers, or Reverend Williams calling an emergency town meeting. Her thoughts were interrupted by the distinctive sound of tires on gravel. Through the window, she saw Sheriff Collins's patrol car pulling up to her gate. 2 bikers immediately moved to intercept him, but Loretta quickly dried her hands and hurried outside. "It's all right," she called to the guards. "Let him through." Sheriff Collins stepped out of his car, his weathered face etched with concern. Despite the intimidating presence of the bikers surrounding them, he maintained his professional composure. "Miss Loretta," he said, tipping his hat. "Quite a situation you've got here." "Would you like some coffee, Sheriff?" she offered, gesturing toward the house. "We can talk inside." Once seated at her kitchen table, the sheriff removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "I've got half the town calling my office, Loretta. They're scared, and I've got reports of Iron Fangs members gathering at the old truck stop on Route 12. Bear, who had joined them, leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "How many?" "At least 50, from what my deputies tell me. Could be more coming." The sheriff looked between them. "Whatever's brewing between your groups, I need to know my town isn't going to become a battlefield." Loretta poured more coffee, her movements deliberate and calm. "Nobody wants that, Sheriff. These people are here to protect Caleb and me." "The boy in your living room?" The sheriff nodded toward the other room. "What kind of trouble is he in?" Bear stepped forward. "The kind that would have gotten him killed if Miss Johnson hadn't found him. The Fangs want him dead, and they don't care who gets hurt in the process." The sheriff absorbed this information with a grave expression. "I've dealt with their kind before. They'll keep pushing until something breaks." He turned to Loretta. "You understand what you're in the middle of here?" "I understand that a young man needed help," she replied firmly. "And I understand that these people," she gestured to Bear and the bikers visible through her windows, "are willing to stand between him and harm. That's good enough for me." As afternoon faded into evening, Bear found Loretta on her porch, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The woods beyond her property seemed darker now, hiding unknown threats in their shadows. "Miss Johnson," he said softly, "I need you to understand something. The Reeds have to stay until we know Caleb is safe. But our presence here, it puts a target on your home. The Fangs won't back down easily." Loretta kept her eyes on the tree line, where pairs of bikers patrolled with flashlights. "My late husband used to say that doing the right thing isn't always doing the easy thing." She turned to face Bear. "That young man in there needed help. Everything else is just details we'll have to sort out." The gathering darkness seemed to press closer around them, full of unseen dangers and uncertain futures. But Loretta held her head high, her small frame straight and dignified. She understood now that her simple act of kindness had drawn her into something larger and more dangerous than she could have imagined. Yet as she gazed out at the woods beyond her property, she felt no regret, only a steady resolve to see this through, whatever might come. Dawn broke over Miss Loretta Johnson's farmhouse, with the aroma of fresh biscuits and strong coffee wafting through the morning air. She had risen before the sun, determined to show her gratitude to the leather-clad guardians who now surrounded her home. Her small kitchen was alive with activity as she moved between counters with practiced efficiency, despite her 82 years. Loretta wiped flour-covered hands on her apron and pulled another tray of golden brown biscuits from the oven. The counter already held stacks of them, keeping warm under clean dish towels. 3 large skillets of scrambled eggs simmered on the stovetop, while a pot of grits bubbled thickly nearby. She had lost count of how many pounds of butter and bags of flour she'd gone through. But it didn't matter. These people were protecting her home. Feeding them was the least she could do. "Miss Johnson, you shouldn't be doing all this by yourself," Rosa said, appearing in the doorway. The younger woman's dark hair was pulled back in a neat braid, her leather vest adorned with patches and pins. Without waiting for a response, she began setting out plates and silverware. "Nonsense," Loretta replied, adding more butter. To the grits. "I've been cooking big breakfasts since before you were born. Besides, it gives me joy to feed people." Bear's massive frame filled the kitchen doorway. "Ma'am, you don't owe us anything. We're here because of an oath, yes," Loretta interrupted gently. "But where I come from, we thank people with food. Now, would you be kind enough to tell everyone breakfast is ready?" The morning air filled with the sound of boots on wooden planks as bikers gathered on and around the porch. Loretta insisted on saying grace before the meal, and to her surprise, every head bowed respectfully as she spoke. "Dear Lord," she began, her clear voice carrying across the yard, "we thank you for this food, for the safety of the night past, and for bringing these good people to our aid. Guide us through whatever challenges lay ahead, and help us remember that family isn't always about blood. Amen." "Amen," rumbled the unexpected chorus of rough voices. As the bikers filled their plates, Loretta stood on her porch and made her announcement. "I want everyone to know that I've decided to formally accept the Reed clan's protection. This isn't just your duty anymore. You're my guests, and this is your home for as long as needed." Bear's expression softened with gratitude, though he tried to hide it behind his gruff exterior. "We'll make sure you don't regret that decision, Miss Johnson." Throughout the morning, Loretta watched as her unlikely guardians began integrating themselves into the community. A group of bikers helped old Mr. Henderson fix his broken fence down the road. Others assisted the widow Mrs. Martinez in hauling away old appliances that had been cluttering her yard. 2 members with mechanical experience even got Tom Wilson's ancient riding mower running again. But not everyone welcomed the changes. Loretta could see Mrs. Peterson and her bridge club gathering across the street, whispering behind their hands and shooting worried glances toward the bikers. Reverend Williams drove by 3 times, his face pinched with concern. "They're scared," Rosa observed, helping Loretta hang laundry in the afternoon sun. "Can't really blame them. We probably look like trouble." "People fear what they don't understand," Loretta replied, pinning a sheet to the line. "But actions speak louder than appearances. Keep helping. Keep being kind. They'll come around." Rosa was quiet for a moment, carefully folding one of Loretta's quilts. "You know, I've been with the Reeds for 5 years now, but this is the first time I've felt like I truly belong somewhere, like I'm part of something bigger than just the clan." Loretta paused in her work, studying the younger woman's face. "Sometimes home finds us in the most unexpected places, dear." Their conversation was interrupted by Bear's deep voice calling from inside the house. "Miss Johnson, he's awake!" Loretta hurried inside to find Caleb conscious, though clearly confused. His eyes darted around the room before settling on her face. You helped me," he managed weakly. "That's right, dear," she said softly, sitting beside him and checking his temperature with a practiced hand. "You're safe now. Your father's here too." Caleb's eyes widened with worry, but Loretta gently squeezed his hand. "Rest now. Everything else can wait." As evening approached, the atmosphere around the farmhouse grew peaceful. Bikers gathered on the porch and in the yard, sharing a simple dinner of sandwiches and potato salad. Someone had brought out a guitar, and soft music mingled with quiet conversation and crickets beginning their nightly chorus. Loretta sat in her rocking chair, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Rosa perched on the porch steps nearby, while Bear stood at the railing, his massive silhouette softened by the fading light. Around them, leather-clad figures talked in low voices, cleaned weapons, or simply enjoyed the cool evening air. Looking at them now, Loretta saw past the tattoos and rough exteriors to the hearts beneath, hearts that had chosen to stand guard over an old woman's home, to help her neighbors, to protect one of their own. These unlikely friends had transformed her quiet life into something extraordinary, and as she watched the sun sink toward the horizon, she felt a deep sense of peace. Sometimes, she reflected, family comes in forms we never expect, and home is wherever love and loyalty take root. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with dew sparkling on the grass around Loretta's farmhouse. The rumble of motorcycles filled the air as groups of bikers headed out into the community, their leather vests gleaming in the morning sun. Word began spreading through town like wildfire about these unexpected Good Samaritans. Mrs. Henderson called her friend Martha, voice filled with amazement. "You won't believe it. 3 of those bikers just spent 2 hours fixing my roof. Wouldn't take a penny for their work either." Similar stories popped up all over town. The Reeds were everywhere, helping elderly neighbors with yard work, repairs, and heavy lifting. They mowed overgrown lawns, trimmed hedges, and even helped clean out cluttered garages. Their hulking presence, initially so threatening, began to take on a different character. By midweek, Loretta decided it was time for a bold move. She gathered a small group of bikers, including Rosa and 2 others named Mike and James, for the Wednesday evening service at First Baptist. "Now remember," she told them as they walked up the church steps, "just be yourselves. God welcomes everyone." The congregation fell silent as the leather-clad group followed Loretta into the sanctuary. Every head turned, and whispers filled the air. The bikers sat quietly in the back pews, their usual confidence somewhat subdued in the unfamiliar setting. Pastor Green, to his credit, didn't miss a beat. "Welcome, everyone," he said warmly from the pulpit. "We're blessed to have new faces joining us tonight." More murmurs rose from the congregation. Mrs. Peterson's disapproving sniff could be heard 3 rows back. But then something remarkable happened. Loretta Johnson stood up. She turned to face the congregation, her white hair catching the light from the stained glass windows. "If I may say something, Pastor." Pastor Green nodded, recognizing the steel in her gentle voice. "My friends," Loretta began, her voice clear and strong, "I've been a member of this church for 52 years. I've seen us welcome strangers, comfort the grieving, and support each other through hard times. Now, I'm asking you to open your hearts again." She gestured to the bikers. "These people have shown me what it means to live out Christian values. They protect the vulnerable, help those in need, and ask nothing in return. Yes, they look different from us. Yes, they live differently. But isn't that exactly why Jesus taught us not to judge by appearances?" A teenage girl in the front row had her phone out, recording Loretta's impromptu sermon. The congregation sat in rapt attention as she continued. Second chances are at the heart of our faith. Compassion is what Jesus preached. These past few days I've seen more genuine kindness from these supposed outlaws than I sometimes see from folks who sit in church every Sunday. Her voice softened. Maybe we're the ones who need to examine our hearts. The silence that followed was profound. Then Pastor Green stepped forward, placing a hand on Loretta's shoulder. Amen, Miss Loretta. Amen. By that evening, the teenage girl's video had been shared hundreds of times online. Comments poured in, many from local residents sharing their own stories of the bikers' good deeds. Back at the farmhouse, a different kind of revelation was taking place. Caleb, finally strong enough to sit up in bed, began sharing his story with Bear and Loretta. I was doing routine surveillance on the Iron Fangs, he explained, his voice still weak but steady. Just keeping tabs on their movements like we always do. But then I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. Bear leaned forward in his chair, his massive frame tense. What did you see, son? They were moving weapons, not just regular guns, military-grade stuff. Stolen from army bases, I think. Caleb's hands trembled slightly. When they spotted me, I knew too much. They would have killed me right there if I hadn't run. Loretta watched as Bear's expression shifted between rage and relief. Rage at those who had threatened his son. Relief that Caleb was finally talking to him again. Why didn't you come to me? Bear asked, his voice rough with emotion. Caleb looked down at his hands. I thought if I came back, they'd hurt the whole clan. Better just me than everyone else. That's not how family works, son, Bear said quietly. We stand together. Always. Loretta discreetly wiped away a tear as she watched father and son begin to bridge the gap between them. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. As evening settled in, rain began tapping gently on the roof. Loretta sat in her familiar rocking chair beside Caleb's bed, watching as he drifted off to sleep. His face looked peaceful for the first time since she'd found him on her porch. Bear stood in the doorway, his massive silhouette softened by the dim light. He's really going to be okay, isn't he? He asked softly. Yes, Loretta replied, her knitting needles clicking softly as she worked. Body and soul both healing now. The rain continued its gentle rhythm on the roof as night settled over the farmhouse. In the darkness outside, reeds stood guard, their leather glistening with raindrops, while inside, a family slowly knitted itself back together, watched over by an angel in a rocking chair. The morning dawned gray and threatening, with rain hammering against the windows of Loretta's farmhouse. Thunder rolled across the sky in waves, making the old house creak and shudder. The storm that had begun the previous night had grown into something fierce, turning the red Alabama clay into flowing rivers of mud. Loretta stood at her kitchen window, watching as water filled the drainage ditches and turned her yard into a maze of puddles. The bikers who had been camping outside huddled under makeshift shelters, their leather jackets glistening with rain. She could see Bear directing some of his people to move their motorcycles to higher ground. This isn't good, Rosa said, coming to stand beside Loretta. The roads will be flooding soon. As if confirming her words, they watched as a pickup truck carefully made its way down the muddy road, its wheels spinning in the thick mud. Behind it came two more vehicles, inching along in the downpour. Those are folks from town, Loretta said, recognizing Mrs. Thompson's blue sedan. They must be having trouble with the flooding. Without hesitation, she grabbed her largest umbrella and headed for the front door. Bear was already there, helping people up onto her wide wraparound porch. The Thompsons, the Wilsons, and old Mr. Parker from the hardware store stood dripping on her welcome mat, looking uncertain as they found themselves surrounded by leather-clad bikers. "Well, don't just stand there getting wet," Loretta called out, opening her door wide. "Everyone inside, Rosa, would you help me get some towels?" Soon, her living room was filling up with an unlikely mix of people. Bikers helped elderly townspeople into comfortable chairs, while children peered curiously at tattoos and patches. The awkwardness was thick enough to cut with a knife, until Loretta stepped in. "I've got a big pot of vegetable soup on the stove," she announced, "and plenty of cornbread to go around. Who's hungry?" Food, as it often did, proved to be the great equalizer. As bowls were passed around and people found places to sit, some on chairs, others on the floor, the tension began to ease. The steady drum of rain on the roof provided a soothing backdrop to the murmur of conversations. Mrs. Thompson, who had been one of the loudest voices against the bikers' presence in town, found herself sitting next to a tattooed man named Mike, who, it turned out, had grandchildren the same age as hers. They were soon deep in conversation about the challenges of modern parenting. Mr. Parker discovered that several of the bikers had extensive knowledge about tools and hardware, leading to an animated discussion about the best brands of power tools. Children darted between the adults, fascinated by the stories and the leather vests covered in patches. In the midst of it all, Caleb had made his way downstairs for the first time since his arrival. He sat in a corner with Loretta, watching the scene with a mixture of wonder and guilt. "I never meant for any of this to happen," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the storm. "When I collapsed on your porch that night, I thought I was going to die. I never imagined it would bring all this trouble to your doorstep." Loretta patted his hand gently. "Honey, helping someone in need is never trouble. Look around you. See what's happening here?" Caleb looked at the room full of people who should have been enemies, but were sharing soup and stories like old friends. "It's amazing," he admitted. "But the Iron Fangs are still out there. They're dangerous people, Miss Loretta. What they're doing? It's serious. Military-grade weapons in the wrong hands could hurt a lot of people." "Then we'll face that when the time comes," she said firmly. "But kindness is never a mistake, Caleb. Sometimes it's the only thing that can break down walls people spend years building." As if to emphasize her point, laughter erupted from across the room, where one of the bikers was teaching Mr. Wilson's young grandson how to play cat's cradle with a piece of string. The rain continued throughout the day, but inside the house, something remarkable was happening. People who had eyed each other with suspicion just days ago were sharing stories, swapping recipes, and finding common ground. When Mrs. Thompson's arthritis started acting up, a biker named Sarah, who was also a massage therapist, helped ease her pain. Mr. Parker discovered that Bear had once been a carpenter, and soon they were drawing up plans to repair the church's leaky roof. As evening approached, Caleb stood up slowly, supported by his father. He cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I need to tell you all something," he said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "You deserve to know the truth about why I'm here, and what kind of danger might be coming." The room fell silent as Caleb explained about the Iron Fangs and their weapons trafficking. He told them about his discovery, his flight, and his fear of bringing trouble to their town. When he finished, there was a long moment of silence. Finally, Mr. Parker stood up. "Son, this is our town. We take care of our own, and that includes Miss Loretta and anyone she chooses to help. Those Iron Fangs want to cause trouble? Well, they'll have to deal with all of us." Murmurs of agreement filled the room. Mrs. Thompson even reached over and patted Caleb's arm. "We may not look as tough as your father's people," she said with a smile, "but we're not exactly helpless either." As the storm began to ease late that night, people started to head home. The townspeople and bikers exchanged phone numbers and promises to keep in touch. Mr. Parker insisted that Bear come by the hardware store to discuss the church roof project. Mrs. Thompson invited several of the bikers to her weekly bridge club. Caleb caught Loretta's eye as people were leaving. "I'll tell everyone," he promised. "The whole town needs to know what's really going on. No more secrets." After the last guest had gone, Loretta sank into her rocking chair, her bones aching with exhaustion but her heart full. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, and the house was quiet except for the creak of her chair and Bear's soft footsteps as he checked the locks. Her eyes grew heavy as she rocked, remembering the unlikely gathering that had filled her home with warmth despite the storm. Perhaps, she thought, as sleep began to overtake her. This was what healing looked like. Not just for Caleb, but for an entire community. Her last conscious thought was a prayer of gratitude before she drifted off, her hands still warm from serving soup to friends old and new. The morning after the storm dawned bright and clear, revealing the aftermath of nature's fury. Loretta stood on her porch, coffee cup warming her hands, surveying the scattered branches and debris that littered her usually tidy yard. The bikers were already hard at work, clearing fallen limbs and righting overturned planters. "Looks like we got some cleanup to do," Bear said, joining her on the porch. His massive frame cast a long shadow in the early morning light. "But first, we need to get ready for church." Loretta nodded, watching as Caleb emerged from the house. He looked different today, stronger, more determined. The dark circles under his eyes had faded, and he stood straighter, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Are you sure about this, son?" Bear asked, his voice gentler than usual. Caleb squared his shoulders. "Yes, sir. It's time everyone knew the truth." They drove to church in Loretta's truck, which the bikers had repaired after the tire-slashing incident. Several motorcycles escorted them, their engines a low rumble in the peaceful Sunday morning. The small white church stood against the blue sky, its steeple reaching toward heaven like a finger pointing the way. Inside, the congregation filled the wooden pews, their Sunday best a stark contrast to the leather vests of the bikers who had joined them. Pastor Matthews welcomed everyone with a warm smile, though his eyes held concern when they fell on Caleb. After the opening hymns, Caleb stood and made his way to the front. Bear followed, positioning himself just behind his son, one hand resting supportively on Caleb's shoulder. The church fell silent, every eye fixed on the young man who had brought such changes to their quiet town. "I owe you all the truth," Caleb began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Some of you have welcomed me into your homes. Others have worried about what my presence means for this town. You deserve to know everything." He spoke for nearly 20 minutes, explaining how he'd discovered the Iron Fang's weapons trafficking operation. His voice shook as he described the military-grade weapons being sold to dangerous people, the threats he'd received when he questioned it, and his desperate flight that led him to Loretta's porch. "I was scared," he admitted, "not just for myself, but for anyone who might help me. But what I've found here, the kindness, the protection, the way this community has come together, it's given me the courage to stand up and do what's right." Bear's hand tightened on his son's shoulder as Caleb finished speaking. For a moment, the church was completely silent. Then Mrs. Thompson stood up, her arthritis forgotten as she walked to the front and wrapped Caleb in a fierce hug. It was like a dam breaking. Suddenly people were standing, applauding, moving forward to offer support and encouragement. Pastor Matthews raised his hands for quiet. "Let us pray," he said, "for protection for this brave young man and for justice to prevail." The drive home was filled with hope and lighter hearts. Several cars followed them back to Loretta's, planning to help with storm cleanup. But as they turned onto her dirt road, the convoy suddenly stopped. Bear's voice crackled over the radio one of his men had given Loretta. "Something's wrong." They could see it from the road. Loretta's storage shed, where she kept her gardening tools and preserved vegetables, had been vandalized. The white-painted walls were covered in crude graffiti, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. But worst of all was the smell of smoke and the blackened patch of grass nearby, still smoldering despite the morning's dew. Bear was out of the truck before it fully stopped, barking orders to his men. "Secure the perimeter. Check every building. Rosa, get Miss Loretta inside." But Loretta couldn't move, her eyes fixed on the scorched earth where someone had tried to set her property ablaze. Bear examined the burn pattern, his face darkening. "This is their mark," he growled. "The Iron Fangs were here." The peaceful afternoon dissolved into frantic activity. Bikers patrolled the property while others reinforced windows and doors. The townspeople who had followed them home pitched in without hesitation. Mr. Parker organizing a group to repair the shed, Mrs. Thompson making phone calls to set up a neighborhood watch. As evening settled over the Kosha property, Loretta stood at her kitchen window, trembling as she watched the last wisps of smoke rise from the damaged grass. Bear appeared beside her, his massive frame blocking out the fading light. "We won't let them hurt you," he said firmly. "This ends now." But Loretta could only nod, her eyes fixed on the scorched earth that marked how close danger had come to her home. The Iron Fangs had made their move, and their message was clear. They weren't going to back down without a fight. The night wrapped Loretta's farmhouse in shadows, broken only by the floodlights the bikers had installed. Inside, Rosa sat beside Loretta on the couch, trying to calm the older woman's trembling hands with a cup of chamomile tea. "The Lord watches over us," Loretta whispered, though her voice wavered. "Even in our darkest moments." Bear paced by the window, his massive frame casting long shadows across the floor. Caleb sat quietly in the corner, guilt etched across his face. The atmosphere was thick with tension, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. The shattering of glass broke the silence. Windows exploded inward as objects crashed through them. Shouts erupted from the tree line, angry voices cutting through the night air. Bear's radio crackled with urgent warnings from his men posted around the property. "Get down," Bear commanded, pulling Loretta behind the couch as smoke began filling the room. Outside, more breaking glass and the distinctive thump of smoke bombs rolling across her yard. The acrid smell seeped through every crack and crevice. Through the windows, they could see small fires sprouting up across the yard like deadly flowers blooming in the darkness. Bikers rushed to stamp them out, their shapes barely visible through the growing haze. "Miss Loretta, stay here," Bear ordered, moving toward the door. "Rosa, watch her." But in the chaos, no one saw the dark figures that had crept behind the shed. No one noticed until it was too late. The smoke provided perfect cover as Iron Fang members emerged from their hiding spot. Caleb had moved to help with the fires when rough hands grabbed him. His shout of surprise was muffled by a cloth pressed against his face. Loretta, peering through her window, saw the struggle just as the smoke began to clear. "Caleb!" she screamed, her voice piercing through the chaos. "Bear! They're taking him!" Bear spun around, his face contorting with rage as he saw his son being dragged away. He bellowed orders to his men, but the smoke made it impossible to see which direction the Iron Fangs had gone. Gunshots rang out, forcing everyone to take cover. "Protect Miss Loretta!" Bear roared above the noise. "Don't let them near the house!" The firefight lasted less than 5 minutes, but to Loretta, it felt like hours. She huddled behind her couch, Rosa's arm around her shoulders, praying harder than she'd ever prayed before. When silence finally fell, it felt almost as terrible as the chaos had been. The sky began lightening in the east when Bear finally came back inside. His face told them everything before he spoke a word. "They're gone," he said heavily, "and they took Caleb." Loretta's legs gave out, and she collapsed into her rocking chair. Her Bible lay on the small table beside her, and she clutched it to her chest like a shield. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as the full weight of what had happened settled over her. "I failed him," she whispered, her voice breaking. "That boy came to me for help, and I failed him." Bear knelt beside her chair, his massive hand covering her small one. "No, Miss Loretta. You gave him something he hadn't had in years, hope, and we're going to get him back." As the sun rose over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the property came alive with activity. Bikers moved with purpose, checking weapons, studying maps, planning routes. Bear stood in the middle of it all, issuing orders with quiet intensity. "We know where their main compound is," he told Loretta, as she watched from her porch. "We've avoided conflict because of old agreements, but they broke those when they came here, when they took my son." Loretta sat in her rocking chair, her Bible open in her lap, watching as the bikers prepared for what was to come. The morning light revealed the full extent of the damage. Broken windows, scorched grass, shell casings glinting in the dirt. But worse than any physical damage was the knowledge that Caleb was gone, taken by the very people he'd fled from. The rescue mission was taking shape before her eyes. Maps were spread across pickup truck hoods, routes marked in red marker. Weapons were checked and loaded with grim efficiency. The air hummed with tension and determination. The morning sun cast long shadows across Loretta's farmyard as bikers gathered around makeshift tables, poring over county maps spread across truck hoods. The air was heavy with determination and barely contained anger. "The tracks lead east," one rider reported, pointing to disturbed grass near the tree line. "They've got compounds in 3 counties, but our sources say they're most likely headed to the old lumber mill." Bear nodded, his face etched with worry lines. He hadn't slept, spending the night coordinating with other riders across the state. Every few minutes, his phone buzzed with updates from sympathetic bikers who'd spotted Iron Fang movements. Loretta emerged from her house, her usual warm presence dimmed by exhaustion. She carried a tray of coffee, though her hands shook slightly as she set it down. "I'm coming with you," she announced, her voice quiet but firm. Bear turned to her, shaking his head. "Miss Loretta, it's too dangerous. These men—" "I need to be there," she interrupted, straightening her shoulders. "That boy is under my protection just as much as yours." "She's right," Rosa spoke up from where she'd been studying the maps. All eyes turned to her as she continued. "Miss Loretta might be the only person who can keep this from turning into a bloodbath. They won't expect her, and she has a way of making people listen." Bear ran a hand over his face, conflict clear in his expression. But looking at Loretta's determined stance, he finally nodded. "All right, but you stay protected at all times." Loretta retreated to her living room while the preparations continued outside. She sat at her small writing desk, pulling out her good stationery paper. With careful strokes, she began writing a letter to Caleb. "Dear Caleb," she wrote, her pen moving slowly as she chose each word with care. "When you're scared, remember that you are loved. Remember that you are worth fighting for. God didn't bring you to my porch by accident." She continued writing, occasionally pausing to pray over the words, asking for guidance to find the right message. Tears spotted the paper as she wrote about hope, forgiveness, and the strength found in letting others help. Outside, the preparations grew more intense as afternoon faded toward evening. Bikers checked their motorcycles, topped off gas tanks, and strapped down essential supplies. A modified sidecar was attached to Bear's bike, reinforced and padded for Loretta's safety. As the sun began to set, Rosa helped Loretta bundle up in warm quilts. The evening air had turned chilly, and the ride would be cold. Loretta tucked her Bible into an inside pocket close to her heart and carefully folded Caleb's letter into its pages. "You sure about this, Miss Loretta?" Rosa asked softly, adjusting a quilt around her shoulders. "When the Lord puts someone in your path to help," Loretta replied, "you don't get to choose how far that help might take you." Bear helped her settle into the sidecar, checking every strap twice. Around them, hundreds of motorcycles lined up in formation, their chrome catching the last rays of sunlight. The rumble of engines filled the air as riders started their bikes, one by one. Loretta gripped her Bible tighter as Bear's motorcycle roared to life beneath them. She'd never imagined herself here, surrounded by leather-clad bikers, heading into danger. But her heart was steady, filled with purpose. They were going to bring Caleb home. The motorcycle engines echoed through the night like rolling thunder as the massive convoy made its way along empty highways. Loretta held tight to the sidecar's frame, her quilts wrapped snugly around her as Bear's bike led the formation. The rhythmic rumble had become almost meditative during their hours of travel. As first light began creeping across the sky, they turned onto a neglected road leading to an abandoned shopping center. Hundreds of bikes from the Iron Fangs already filled the cracked parking lot, their riders standing in rigid formation. Bear pulled to a stop, and the reeds fanned out behind him in practiced precision. "Stay close," Bear murmured as he helped Loretta from the sidecar. Two riders immediately flanked her as she walked forward, her steps steady despite her exhaustion. Through the sea of leather-clad figures, she spotted Caleb. He stood between two massive Iron Fang members, his face bruised and his clothes dirty, but alive. Their eyes met briefly before he looked down, shame evident in his posture. The Iron Fang's leader, Viper, stepped forward with a cruel smile. "All this trouble for one traitor? This ends now," Bear's voice carried across the lot. "We can settle this peaceful, or what?" Viper sneered. "You'll start a war over some snitch?" Loretta moved then, shrugging off her escort's hands. She walked into the space between the two groups, her small figure somehow filling the vast emptiness. When she spoke, her voice trembled but grew stronger with each word. "I'm just an old woman," she began, "but I've lived long enough to see how hatred destroys everything it touches." She turned slowly, meeting eyes in both groups. "Every one of you was somebody's baby once. Someone held you and dreamed of your future. And now here you stand, ready to kill each other over pride and fear." Several younger Iron Fang members shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping to the ground. One removed his helmet, revealing a face barely out of his teens. "The truth Caleb carries isn't just about weapons," Loretta continued. "It's about what happens when we let darkness into our hearts. But mercy?" She placed her hand over her Bible. "Mercy is stronger than vengeance. It takes more courage to forgive than to fight." Silence fell across the parking lot. Even the morning birds seemed to pause their songs. Viper's jaw clenched as he looked at his men, noting their reactions to Loretta's words. After what felt like an eternity, he spat on the ground. "Take him," he growled, shoving Caleb forward, "but this better be the end of it." Bear stepped up, his voice firm but measured. "We want peace terms, written and witnessed. No retaliation, no escalation. Both sides agree to stay in their territories." More discussion followed, tense but controlled, as terms were hammered out. Loretta stood witness as both leaders signed an agreement on the hood of a bike, their signatures illuminated by the rising sun. As the Iron Fangs began to disperse, Caleb stumbled toward Loretta. She opened her arms, and he collapsed into them, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for bringing this to your door." "Hush now," she soothed, holding him like she would a child. "You're going home." The reeds formed a protective circle around them as Bear helped them both into the sidecar. As they started the journey home, the sun broke fully over the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of pink and gold. The rumble of motorcycles announced their return, drawing curious neighbors to their windows. As Loretta's property came into view, the morning sun highlighted every bit of damage from the previous day's chaos. Without being asked, the Reeds immediately sprang into action. Bear organized teams, his voice carrying across the yard. "Glass team here, painters there. We need lumber for the shed and some flowers to brighten things up." Within hours, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air. Bikers in leather vests carefully installed new window panes, while others mixed paint to cover the scorch marks. Rosa supervised the shed rebuilding, her expertise showing as she directed the frame construction. Around noon, the first townspeople arrived. Mrs. Henderson from the church brought 3 steaming casseroles. "We saw everything on the news," she said, hugging Loretta. "You showed us what real courage looks like." More neighbors followed, carrying toolboxes, gardening supplies, and more food. The pastor arrived with his sleeves already rolled up, ready to work. Children darted between the adults, handing out cold drinks and snacks to the workers. A week later, Pastor Green stood on Loretta's freshly mowed lawn, addressing the gathered crowd at what he called the Community Unity Festival. Streamers decorated the trees, and the air smelled of grilled burgers and hot dogs. "This gathering represents the best of our town," he announced, gesturing to the mixed crowd of leather-clad bikers and local families. "Miss Loretta taught us that family isn't just about blood. It's about opening our hearts." Children squealed with delight as bikers gave them rides on parked motorcycles. Senior citizens from the church swayed to old gospel tunes, some even teaching younger riders how to two-step. The celebration lasted well into the afternoon, bridging gaps that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Caleb and Rosa approached Loretta where she sat watching the festivities. "We've rented the Johnson place down the road," Caleb told her, his eyes bright. "Close enough to help with anything you need." "But far enough not to crowd you," Rosa added with a wink. As the sun began its descent, Bear called for everyone's attention. He held a carefully wrapped package. "Miss Loretta," he announced, his voice unusually soft, "the Reeds have a tradition of honoring those who become family." He unveiled a beautiful leather vest, decorated with intricate angel wings embroidered in silver thread. "We hereby name you our road mother," he declared, helping her slip it on as cheers erupted from the crowd. "You'll always have our protection and our love." The evening wound down gently. Loretta settled into her favorite rocking chair on the porch, surrounded by her unlikely new family. Bikers lounged on the steps while neighbors chatted in lawn chairs. The setting sun painted everything in warm golden light. Looking out over the peaceful scene, children playing tag between motorcycles, elderly church ladies sharing recipes with tattooed riders, Caleb and Rosa helping clean up, Loretta felt her heart overflow. "All this," she whispered, shaking her head in wonder, "just because I fed a stranger." If this story made you pause, reflect, or even smile, don't forget to subscribe. I post daily, and the next story might be exactly what you need to hear.